Hey, welcome everybody.
Hey y'all, welcome to this episode of Getting My Cheese Back on My Cracker. I'm Ashley Nicole,
And I'm Paige Benjamin of Atomic Travels.
and this is Getting My Cheese Back on My Cracker. So there was this, I'm gonna jump right into it. There was this video, this skin bleaching video that was circulating on social media where this girl talks about how her whole life she wanted to be light skinned and all of the things that she did and how many years she bleached her skin. But it ended with the fact that she now loves herself and she doesn't bleach her skin and she teaches her daughters to love themselves. Either way, it sparked a debate. Any discussion in any country on colorism around the world leads to a debate that I don't think is ever resolved. So I wanted to talk about the historical precedents, the psychological impact, and why this discussion needs to happen. Um, how was your history, or what do you think of when you think of colorism and skin bleaching and all that good stuff?
I'm not gonna lie to you, colorism didn't become a thing until college, right? For me, grew up West Indian, Haitian born. Yep, sac passe, Zo's in the house. Brooklyn, New York. I mean, for me, it was more cultural divide than color. And so, if you're talking about growing up in Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, it was really Jamaicans versus everybody else. And we gonna have one of our guests come on here think Jamaicans is the best, but we gonna let her rock with that. But it was more of a construct of like where you're from, and what nationalities were accepted. It wasn't until
Mm-hmm.
I got to college where I started to learn more about um how there was such a thing as a paper bag test, right? Amongst different social groups within the United States during that time, and those things are still in place. And as I started to learn more and more about my culture, I also started to realize that even in Haiti, there's a social hierarchy, and where the bourgeoisie, who happened to be those of a lighter color, pretty much ran a lot of what was going on in the country. So for me, the construct of colorism wasn't really presented until I started to learn more about my individual culture, as well as understanding more about African American history.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
Well, so it's been a problem my whole life because my family's, well, y'all have met my older siblings, but my family that I grew up with, my little sisters and all of my cousins, all of my grandmother's grandchildren, everybody's light skinned except for me and my twin sister. We were only darkies, and we played outside all day. So I was like 4 shades darker than I am right now as a child, and everybody
Mhm.
else is red or yellow. And I like to say my little babe sisters and brothers, all of them were light skinned. And you know how you have that one mischievous child. My cousin told us one time that my grandma didn't like us because we was black.
Oh,
So it's been little things like that ever since we were younger, and ever since then, when things happen, I always sit. It's always in the back of my mind, like, is it because I'm dark, or is it because I just didn't earn it, or is it because I'm dark, or is it because I wasn't smart enough? Is it because I'm dark, or is it because of this, that, or that? Whatever the challenge was, I always have to remember this happened, and I'm also dark skinned. So it's always been something that I've been aware of. So that's why I think this discussion definitely needs to happen. And I think that we have two wonderful guests that can definitely speak on the issue. But before we welcome our guests, I do want to remind you, if you haven't, to please click the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so that you're notified each time we have a new show. We have a new episode of the Women's Collective coming up this Thursday. We just had an episode of the State of the Black Man's Mental Health this Saturday. And if you had that notification turned on, you
you were
might
in.
have caught it.
Yep. And if you don't mind me introducing these two beautiful queens onto the stage, right? So we have two recurring guests, right? The first one, she is a young phenom. She's changing the minds of millions, one company at a time, one organization at a time, one management level. How can I put it? She's shifting how we see things and how we see the world so that we can be a more efficient self. Um, this young lady was introduced through a friend of mine, and I think I'm closer to her than I am him at this point. But what I will say is, I'm gonna bring on the amazing Takia Butler to introduce herself.
Hi. That made me blush. It's good to see y'all.
All right, all right. And this next queen, when you talk about a legacy, when you talk about change shaping the minds, when you talk about nurturing, when you talk about just being an amazing performer, musician, writer, she's humble when it comes to her accolades. But you know what? We're gonna bring on the amazing Nakiba and let her introduce herself to y'all.
Greetings, everyone. Feeling very privileged to be in the space. I'm Nakiba Manier, also Nakiba Walk, also known as Nakiba Roots, and I'm the founder and executive director of Yay Educational Consulting. And I feel really good that we have been called to the space to really pull apart or tackle this issue that is colorism. So thanks for
All right.
having me.
Awesome, awesome. And Takia, I mean, you got to reintroduce yourself. She did her whole thing again. So, I mean, let's go.
No, I appreciate that. So my name is Takia Butler. I'm the principal owner of Excelsior Performance Group. So it's a performance improvement boutique firm. So I do leadership and executive coaching, strategic planning, and sort of knowledge management. And then also I'm really trying to think about ways to help change our community through individual growth. So in short, I try to help people get better from where they started to where they're sort of headed, and over time get stronger, more effective, reflective, and inclusive. And I try to do that by showing up with grace, integrity, and love.
So y'all hear that?
Awesome.
Grace, integrity, or love. That's
Hold
she's
me
on
to
my
it.
cracker all day. You know
Amen.
what I mean?
Amen.
Both of y'all intros got me want to go.
Yeah.
Yes,
If I could snap, I would join you.
Going down. It's going down. This is good.
Awesome, awesome. Ashley?
All right, so we're going to kick this off with the first question now that we've got y'all introduced. What is it that you understand colorism to be, and how has it affected you?
Either one of y'all could hop on the question.
I guess I can hop in first. So colorism. So on a macro level, being attached to certain systems and being an observer of things from a very young age, having seen it and being of a beautifully darker melanated hue, having been the recipient of colorism, I have a very intimate relationship with how I understand it. Um, but essentially, it's just prejudice and discrimination based on the darkness of your skin tone or proximity to whiteness. So the closer you are to this ideal, this white ideal or whiteness shows up in you, you'll have more access to power, privilege, opportunities, jobs, preferential treatment. And the further you are away on that spectrum, you'll have less opportunity and less favor, and significantly rooted in imperialistic and colonialist history that has uplifted that and platformed that and kind of made that a pervasive mindset that permeates the way that we move through the world. I don't know if it got too deep, but on a real basic level, just being an Afro Caribbean, African American girl and seeing how preferential treatment was doled out based on proximity to whiteness, based on lightness, based on how you show up in a space, and how it became a real prison in terms of an internalized thing for a lot of folks trying to reach for in a myriad of ways that whiteness and how it shows up and trying to get access to the privilege that it afforded other folks. And so, yeah, that's a mouthful, but
And so I'm gonna tap you a little bit more here, right? So as a mom of a village, right? I mean, she has the amazing, most amazing kids. Yeji, what's up? What's up? How do you kind of shape the way they see this as being a parent, right? Because the way you felt dictates how you choose to teach your children about colorism and or about how to treat others regardless of skin tone. How do you dive into that lesson in, not showing preference?
Oh, that's a good question. I wouldn't say it's unorthodox parenting style, but I'm kind of like allowing my kids to experience the world while we talk about it and think through it together. And I think for me, even professionally, like when I'm leading groups through diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space, that's kind of what we do. We center your own personal experience and then allow that to be how we pick apart what happens in the world and how you show up in the world and how you show up with regards to your power and privilege in the world. And so my children are along the spectrum of beautiful melanin. And so I allow for them to experience the world, and then we talk and think about it. And then, there are like specifically explicit teaching moments, like when we look into things like the doll test and when we refer to things like the brown paper bag test, and when we think about things that come up with regards to beauty and image and hair and things that are unmistakably and unapologetically Black about the way we show up in terms of our physical and aesthetic appearance. I try to make those more of teaching moments so that they understand that there is a mentality that exists in the world that states this, and it isn't necessarily correct or right. It's absolutely wrong. But it's important for us to identify that it exists and that it is there, because you will be moving from a state of privilege and preference, and not really understanding why you're doing that, because the world is aligned right. The world is aligned in a way that it's supposed to platform and uplift whiteness. And if we don't acknowledge that from the jump and make sure that we're doing everything in our power to disrupt and eradicate that, then we're just kind of playing into it.
So Takia, we're gonna get to you, right? How do you define or understand colors in the bee, and how has it affected you?
Yeah, so firstly, let me start out very vulnerably that this is a really uncomfortable conversation because at 34, I'm realizing I'm perceived as light skinned, and I didn't necessarily perceive myself that way. So I'm really trying to, hopefully I show up authentically in this conversation. I would definitely say any ism, right, is when you start to objectify people based on something you perceive about them. So colorism being these perceptions that we have on people, specifically in the Black community, because we've kind of created these gradients. What I've also noticed is that those gradients move. So maybe in some spaces I might be, so in my family is, and I'll give the backstory for this, but my family is incredibly light skinned, like real high yellow, like I'm brown in my family. So growing up, I didn't think of myself as light skinned. I thought my translucent cousins were light skinned, and that light skin included having red hair. There were certain like other features that aligned with it. It wasn't until I got to college that I was told by men that I was light skinned. So I think there's a whole other aspect about relationships and how people choose partners that has to do with colorism. And that's where a lot of the difficulty of colorism shows up in my life. So hopefully, we'll talk about that later on. But the context for me around colorism kind of starts with my great grandfather, whose mother was either raped or in a relationship with a white man. And so my family comes from South Carolina. They're Gullah. So he grew up looking, and my grandma described him as looking like Blake Griffin. So real light skin, red hair. That was how he looked. And so he had this opportunity to pass. And not only did he choose not to pass, but he also married a very, very darker skinned Black woman who was my great grandmother. My understanding of my family is that my great grandmother had a lot of color issues and will often tell her kids and other people to marry light skinned. So there's this other aspect, and I think Nikiva kind of spoke to this around how it kind of becomes a mindset in folks' minds. So I have all these, my grandmother and her siblings, 11 or 12, 11 of them, and they never had to sharecrop. There were a lot of things they didn't have to do because they had this grandfather who was essentially paying for their well-being. So there's a other economic conversation as well as this trauma around how my family became light-skinned in the first place. And knowing that history has made me sit in my color very differently. My mother is darker skinned than myself. And so she had her own kind of thoughts and concerns. And I don't want to use the word issue, but she had her own hangups around color and how she felt like she was treated by her siblings. So I grew up being the lighter skinned daughter of a woman who would consider herself darker skinned in a very high yellow family. So, and then having a father whose family was incredibly dark skinned, but my dad's the only light skinned person. So for me, color has always been real confusing. And through all of that, my family's been very pro Black. So grew up having to say I'm black and I'm proud in the mirror every morning. I grew up celebrating Kwanzaa. There's a lot of ways that I grew up in my blackness that didn't have anything to do with my color. So I understand colorism on a real logistics level. I understand it in terms of my family and my history. It's affecting me now more than I think it had ever affected me in any other part of my life, because I'm experiencing men who are almost choosing me because they perceive me to include proximity to whiteness, whether I actually see myself that way at all. So I think, Paige, I sent you a text with a little meme. Like, all my life I've been, I'm black, I'm black, I'm blackity black. And now I'm realizing that people are
Right.
almost choosing me because they're thinking, okay, I can take her into this room or take her into that room. That's been a real source of not cognitive dissonance, but discomfort for me that I'm really trying to navigate through. And later on in the conversation, I'll bring up a conversation I had with a real good friend who I had to let go because I realized her own colorism was causing her to see me in a certain way to where we couldn't be sisters. It was like, it felt like there was this real weird competition between us. And I'm seeing all of her black features and finding her beautiful, and she's seeing my features and finding them white, which is confusing for me.
So you guys both touched on something, and I told Jackie I'm about to go. I mean, I told Ashley I'm about to go. See, I have my wife on my mind so much that
We love that.
listen, baby, if you watching, I did it by accident, on purpose. Um, you guys both touched on it a little bit, right? Colorism is not necessarily a choice, but something we may have inherited, right? Let's touch on that, right? Because if anybody understands anything about slavery in that time, there were preferential treatments based on your color, right? And it was primarily due to the fact that you either were the child of, or you just happened to be a fairer skin, but child of the slave master, and you were getting preferential treatment, or you were closer to. Can we talk about that and how you think that we've potentially, and not necessarily potentially, in my personal opinion, but I would like to hear from y'all. How have these inherited traumas passed down? Like, how do you guys perceive that as something we've inherited and it's a trauma we still need to get over, or is it also a systemic issue that's stemmed from that point in time?
I don't think it is something that we've transcended. It's something that we've inherited, and it's something that has been adaptive to the way in which we experience the world. It it is rooted in and like we mentioned before, this proximity to that is white, that is good, that is pure, all of the things, and there's a lot of elements of popular culture that uplift it in a very implicit way. But I think when we speak about it explicitly, and we like kind of rip away the covert nature of the conversation and of the understanding, because it can become a very personal conversation based on your positionality or proximity or how you leverage closer or further away from this ideal of whiteness. But it's happening now. It happens now. So when I was my grandfather passed away a few years ago, and went back to Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica, for the funeral. And when I went, I was looking around and trying to feel out whose family. And I grew up in Jamaica, between Jamaica and New York City. So it's like everybody's family, everybody's close. And I saw this young lady, but I didn't recognize her. And I pulled my other cousin to the side, who is lighter skinned. And I said, who is this kid? Like, who is this person? Like, how is this person like related to us and connected to us? She's like, oh, that's Lisa. And I'm like, Lisa? And I could not, for the life of me, like, I grappled with that very hard. I ran into the room. I burst out in tears. Like, I could not hold myself together emotionally because the person that I saw wasn't the person that I grew up seeing. Lisa aesthetically had a similar complexion to me. And when I saw her, she was extremely light, and I would see like little imprints on her fingertips and like elbows and knees, and places where like the skin in there is, there's a commitment. Once you make a commitment to a physical process of doing this, there's a commitment to ensuring that you don't show up in the world as how you were naturally born and cultivated, and when the sun kisses your skin, and all of the beautiful things about how our melanin absorbs being in the beautiful universe, it's like they become null and void because there's a consumption, and I have to reverse what is happening with me naturally in order to appear the way that's going to afford me more privilege, access to male attention, access to jobs, access to things that I had less access to when I appeared in my natural skin. So it's like there is an affirmation of the way that I show up naturally isn't beautiful. And I think historically there have been um, there have been some things that have happened over time that have uplifted that, but we really need to make sure that we speak about it from a historical context as well as a present tense context, because it happens day to day, every day, in ways that we don't really think a lot about, especially if we are closer on that spectrum. I think you mentioned something earlier, Paige, about being a young man and it not really being something that came up for you until you got to college or until you got older. What as a young woman is always on my mind, and as Takia mentioned earlier, like having a dark-skinned mother and being lighter skinned and in a pro-black family who like the just the internal texture of the conflict, whether it be personal or as a collective. There's a lot to hold, and people don't want to acknowledge it because it means acknowledging some sort of diminishing aspects of self or things that you don't really want to grapple with in a real way. I was a longer answer, but we gonna bring it today. It's colorism. It's for real.
We
Yeah,
That
definitely
was a
gonna bring
perfect
it.
answer.
yeah.
Takia?
Can you repeat the question again, Paige? Because I was really tapped into. It
So
took me on a journey because I was like, "Who is Lisa?" And then the dots connected for me. Can
right.
you repeat
I
the
mean,
question,
and
Paige?
it's really tapping into the historical relevance and the institutional relevance of colorism, right?
Yeah.
Um, is it both inherited trauma as well as a continuation of a systemic limitation on our people to kind of keep us separated? Because if we talk about systemic racism, right, it's primarily to keep us apart and not to keep us as a unified front.
Yeah, and so to separate, right, the difference between like individual. So now they have in all the DEI spaces, they'll give you these levels of racism, right? So you got that individual level, you have maybe organizational, and then they'll talk about this larger structural or systemic racism. And I think in that systemic racism, I think it's worth somebody doing some research on whether being lighter skinned or darker skinned actually makes a difference, because at the end of the day, if you're black or perceived as black, you're going to experience certain limitations regardless. And so I think as a community, we need to start having some conversations about how internal this colorism conversation is, and whether we're reinforcing something that maybe the rest of the world does or doesn't see. I've been confused in white spaces for a black woman that I know is like a totally different skin tone than me, and purely because both of us are black or short, whatever reason it is in someone's head, they're mixing the two of us together. So I don't know how much of our colorism experience has anything to do with anybody outside of ourselves. I know if you go to an Indian community, they're dealing with it, with issues in the caste system. They're dealing with their own, variations of what color means, and proximity to whiteness, and opportunities and access. Um, on a personal level, I do think I do believe in intergenerational trauma. I believe this idea that certain beliefs are passed down somewhat genetically, but also in the way that you're nurtured and in the conversations that are had around you. So for me, hearing my mom often talk about how she believes she had been treated unfairly created narratives in my head around, made me more aware of colorism. But now I'm at a certain point in my life where I also wonder, because I don't want to question my mom's experience, but I recognize that sometimes my mom adds or embellishes more. So I'm struggling with, how do I look at when she's told me a story about her and family member X, and it's got my family member seeming really like violent and mean, and literally having scrubbed my mom's skin. Like, my mom's told me stories that are so heinous to me. She said them really calmly, but they're heinous. And I'm like, how do I sit in that? It's not my job to determine whether or not it's true, but I'm still like a part of this family. So when you're telling me you had this trauma from this person, like, how do I sit in that as your child? So there are a lot of things that I think in the overarching silence of our family we haven't really dealt with, which is a larger conversation around you'll have these dramas and traumas and you don't ever really address them. But the ones that deal with colorism, it feels like it'll be even longer before we address those. There might be other types of trauma that we would be a lot more willing to go to the mat with than we would be about colorism. um, I'll stop there, I guess, in that point of talking about how it has affected me personally, and just
Mhm.
also reiterate that I think now that we're having a lot of these DEI conversations and all of these like diversity conversations, Black is being lumped together in the greater sense in some ways that may or may not separate us in the ways that we've been separating ourselves.
Mhm.
Yeah. I just want to add really quick, we have to be intentional about that separation though.
Yeah.
And so even the term BIPOC that has emerged, or a lot of different nuances to how we not only deal with racism, racic structure against people of color, but specifically anti-Blackness and um, how that shows up in particular with the texture of the history of this country. And just speaking really quickly to what you are saying, you know, as African people, we have this really interesting relationship with physical violence and spiritual violence and emotional violence, and how we determine things to be violent on our spirit. And so even that conflict that you might be feeling around your mother's experience, and how heinous it sounds to you, but how calmly she speaks about it, because of our relationship with being carted into the country as chattel, you know, and how that embeds a certain mindset that isn't rooted in reality, but is rooted in our real experience. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's devastating when that trauma is passed down. So I'm sending love and light to you and your mom as you
And I
feel
appreciate
through
that.
that.
Yeah, and I appreciate
Absolutely.
that.
So I want to actually, before you continue, right? I want to dive a little deeper into that, right? So, we mentioned the mixed race family members, which led to different skin tones. Um, we're in an era of which there are a lot of black folks who are white as well, like biracial people, right? But they're more favoring the white side of things. Um, how do we talk about that, right? Because I was watching an IG post or a reel the other day, and this gentleman was talking about how he was dating this white lady and she didn't know that he was also black, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she continued to talk derogatory about black folks. And it's one of those things where um that's a weird place to be, right? Like, he identifies as black but he clearly looks white. How, and I'm not expecting you guys to talk, like, to be experts on this, but like, how do we talk about that, right? Because I think that's another thing, because I think we have people like Logic, like Drake, like a couple of artists out there that are biracial, but kind of identify as one. I'm gonna say Logic more so than Drake. Logic looks like he's a straight up white boy, but his content is driven towards the African American community, or a generalized African American community. How do we tap them into this conversation, or do they fit into this conversation at all?
Yeah. Did you want to go first, Sakia, or
I did write some notes.
Okay, go ahead.
right
So it's
behind you?
funny because there's this Drake song that I kind of like, but he has this part where he's talking about his dad, and then he's like, my dad didn't show up for me, classic Black American dad story. And I remember I always kind of like sit in that because I'm like, that's very interesting of you as a Canadian to say, as well as you as a biracial man to assign or ascribe this idea of like the American Black dad has this experience of not being present. And so it makes me think a lot about culture and Blackness as culture. So I
Mhm.
think the last time I was here, I talked about my family being Gullah and me being really clear about my family culture. So my Blackness is very much tied into me also knowing that I'm Gullah, knowing what storytelling means, knowing the way we talk, knowing the way of when we all sing together, how it feels in the room. So my Blackness never felt like it was necessarily tied to my color. um, I think we as a whole, especially in America, lack a sense of our culture and what it actually means to be Black. So I don't know that I can tell a Logic or a Drake, hey, you are or not Black. I can maybe say, hey, you're carrying certain stereotypes that I don't agree to be Black, and have some of those conversations about, well, how do you define your Blackness, or how do you know that you're Black? But I don't really want to play the one drop rule game. because we all probably kind of get knocked out at some point. My uncle, my mom's brother, did a DNA, the ancestry test, and he got the ancestry test back. Granted, it won't be the same. He got it back and it said he was 37% Nigerian. So how do we hold that when he's light skinned? So what difference does the color make if we leverage DNA testing and say where somebody comes from? And what difference does the color make if we're talking about culture?
Mm.
I have a bit of a different take. I think your own personal experience is to be defined by you. So I'm one of four children. My oldest brother is extremely light skinned. My younger brother is brown skinned in my perception, and my sister is brown skinned. So of the four of us, I guess I'm the most melanated or darker hue. Um, but growing up, my brother and I noticed him having access to things that I didn't have access to. And I know that was rooted in some patriarchy as well as colorism. And even like how it played out in particular. And when you think about artists like Drake and Logic, they have access to a wider and wide reaching fan base because it's rooted in their proximity to what the ideal is. Like they like, and if dope, I love Drake, and Logic, and the way they're masterful as an MC is all good. But that access that's rooted in the perception and how they look, and how that's why I wanted to tweak my answer a bit, because the aesthetic representation of how you show up in a space determines how people place you right then and there. And they're not asking you for DNA results, and they're not asking you for if you have one drop of of Southern California, Carolina blood, Oklahoma. They're making decisions about you based on how they see you, what happens when they interact with how you aesthetically show up in a space. And we do that as a culture. We decide who we want to let into our living rooms, what we want to let into our phones, who we want to let into our intellectual spaces, who has credence. Like if we didn't have so-called our black president Barack Obama be a lighter hue? Would he be a darker hue man and be considered as intelligent or as deep or as smart or as groundbreaking or accessible to that uh, title as the most powerful man in the land in the world? Would that be a conflict? So
I
I
mean,
think
that could still, and my apologies. I try
no,
not to do this,
no,
but
no, let's
that
go.
could still be debated, right?
Mhm.
The conspiracy theorists, right, put that his white lineage has led him to the office, right? And once again, we're not here to spew fake news, but you think about how he had access by association, right? If you growing up with the Bushes, having access, I think you know his scenario brings up a conversation around um it goes beyond just color, but
Yeah.
then status and where we fit into society.
So,
So
so
go
I would
ahead.
just say that the man is a brilliant architect and orator, and
Hmm.
everything that he aspired to and achieved, he earned. His proximity to whiteness offered him a platform of access, in my opinion, that might not have been afforded to someone that had a similar brought up seed and a darker hue. And maybe that's a controversial statement, maybe that's crazy, but the I don't think the larger majority would have embraced him and his ideals if his aesthetic representation was more of a darker hue.
So I'm going to jump in for a second because before Barack Obama becomes president, he's senator. And the position that he had was actually held by another black man prior to him, Harold Washington. And so Harold Washington's a favorite of mine. He died literally the day I was born. So he's a person I've studied a lot. And
Hmm.
I wonder sometimes if he would have lived, what his trajectory would have been and what that would have meant for someone like Barack Obama. So it's hard with conversations like this. And so the researcher in me wants to create a real clean environment that's boarded off so we can do some studies, because it's hard to know. Independent of colorism in my blackness, I'm trying to ask myself, how do I show up authentically in white spaces as myself? And could I be accepted with my curly hair? So I'm not straightening my hair anymore. Could I be accepted? No nicknames. My name is Takia, say it completely. And how would I be received? What I've been experiencing is it's actually easier to be in relationship with white folks when I'm showing up as myself. I don't think that tapping back into a colorism conversation says that then you shouldn't think about color, but it really makes me wonder how much of the trauma we're experiencing is self-inflicted on us within the wheels of our community. And I don't know how to hold this internal conversation we need to have with these external forces that are acting on us. We live in a greater economy that's more than just us as Black people. We are, to your point about access, we have to live in this greater world and get jobs and get opportunities. In the perfect world, I would like all of us to walk into those spaces 100% ourselves and confident in what we could do and feeling like we would get the best foot put forward. I'm not sure if color is ultimately the thing that stops us because the person is perceiving our color when they're not Black, or if we're walking in assuming that we're going to be treated a certain way. I really don't know.
No,
Um,
that's a
Mhm.
dynamic point.
That's
That's
a
yeah.
valid. That's a definitely a valid point. But I also wanted to ask. So, since you kind of touched on the subject, I want to step back into it. How much of the light skin, dark skin debate are stereotypes that we actually believe, or how much do you think that these debates are stereotypes that we actually believe, and how much are things that's kind of been passed down?
I think
Because
it's nature nurture thing. I think as you know, to Takia's point, there's part of it that lives inside of us, right? And how much we allow it to be our guiding, our North Star, if you will, that will impact how we interact with the universe. I acknowledge that it's present, and I enter unapologetically into spaces intentionally because I know it's present. And I know that there's a tendency to code switch. There's a tendency to, one of the 14 principles of white supremacy is a right to comfort, offering a right to comfort or demanding a right to comfort. I know that folks of color go into those spaces and really want to extend that right to comfort to white folks, if not by force, if not forced out of space, or to be welcomed into space um, in a more amicable way. So it's how I show up. The debate happens intergenerationally. It happens with older folks. It happens with folks in our generation. It happens with folks that are younger. Um, and there is a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing to it that people do. But when I really see it impacting, like I'm raising beautiful Black daughters and understand how the world might perceive them and understand how it's important for them to see themselves beyond the way in which the world might perceive them. Um, and so I can only speak to that from like a really personal perspective, as my opinions live in how I just observe the world and how the world works.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't so light skin, dark skin. So it's easier for me to think about it when I think about men. I think maybe sometimes than when I think about women. So when I think about whatever stereotypes exist, I think people think that light skinned men are super emotional. That there are like certain things that are ascribed to light skin. I think of when I think dark skin, this is this sense of aggression, this sense of like big and badness and this scariness. I think there are certain stereotypes. The big bad and the scary part, I'm not sure how much of it lives once again within our community versus outside, but I do know that the light skin sort of being a little bit more emotional is an aspect. It's funny because I only dated one real light skinned dude in my life, and he was pretty emotional. So I struggle with that. He also had come from a Haitian family, and in his family, he was a lighter skinned person, and I saw him be treated very differently than I saw his siblings be treated. So I have observed these things and sort of how people were treated. So I don't know. It feels real chicken and egg. Like, at some point, I think you use the word nurturing. At some point, it's kind of like we get ascribed a certain way and then we act within it. But to step back, I think this historical attraction to lighter skinned people has a lot to do with procreation and a lot to do with survival.
Tribalism.
Um, and so the more we start to understand the whys behind these stereotypes, I think they would do us a lot of favors, and especially in deciding whether or not we want to keep them moving forward.
so earlier you mentioned the conversation you had with your friend. And this is probably gonna tie into this question, like how often do you have to deal with the light skin, dark skin slander, right? And based on that conversation, was it like, oh, you lucky because you're light skin, everybody look at you first, or what was that conversation, at least surface level, that you can speak on? Because you brought it up, I didn't.
I did bring it
Uh,
up because I prayed about
uh,
whether to talk about it, so we can talk about it.
how do you manage that, and how frequent does that happen for you both? And Takia, since you have a nice story to tell, let's go from there.
So it was a relatively short conversation, and I had never really had this conversation with anybody before. So she and I go real far back, and so it was kind of a moment of me trying to express something. The point I was trying to get across to her was the feeling was how hard it is to find partners, because I realized at some point when you ask somebody, why do you like me, and if the first thing that comes out is you light skinned or your skin, something to that point, there's certain things that people would say, and how it made me feel like someone wasn't with me. They were with me for what opportunities they thought I could afford. Now, professionally, I'm also in some of these rooms, so it's difficult to determine if it's about my color or about the access to power that I have. But the conversation with her, as I started to lay that out, her response to me was, so I was saying, like, I feel like people think I have like these white features. And she was like, you do have white features. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's like, it's your hair, it's your nose. And she starts sprouting off all of this stuff. And I'm like, I was literally like, have you ever seen a white person with hair like this? Like, what are you talking about? And so there was this aggression with her. Now we have this backstory of overlapping in partners. And so
Mm,
it made me think about the choices she made to date someone after me. And so in the rest of the conversation, I said, well, normally I think there's an aspect of self-hatred in some of what I'm hearing. And I was referring to the people I was dating, but she kind of took it as herself. The conversation got real aggressive from there, and I ended the conversation. Something happened shortly after, and we honestly haven't spoken since. That was this past summer. But my heart was really hurt because in the entire time that I knew her, she was younger than me. I saw her kind of like I saw her as a sister, and still perceive her as a sister. But I didn't realize that underlying all that, sometimes I experience this apprehension with women when I'm trying to join in sisterhood. And I never used to be able to really put a word on it. But now that I'm a little older, and me and my mom have had some conversations where when I turned 34, it was the first time my mom ever told me I was pretty. So my whole
mm,
life, I wasn't perceiving myself the way other people were perceiving me. I was used to the girl in sweatpants because my brothers and my dad were hiding me my whole life. So now that I'm stepping out and trying to truly be myself, I'm realizing that there's this I don't think that jealousy is the right word, because I think it's a little too one to one. So I don't know if it's jealousy, but there's this like apprehension to be in relationship with me. And so I'm really struggling in that. I'm really grieving in that. And that one conversation with her kind of really elucidated one of those moments for me. So this whole the light skin, dark skin, the stereotypes, all of these things, I feel like I'm sitting in now, taking some blinders off and seeing people see me in a way that I never even saw myself. And it's incredibly heartbreaking for me on a personal level.
Yeah,
mm.
sis.
It's
I just
deep.
want to. I'm sorry, but I just want to hold some space for that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I want to lean into that and hold some space for that. Not lean into your personal experience, but just lean into the vulnerability it took to share that. That's
Deep.
powerful, sis.
I appreciate
And
that.
and just lift up your words. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that and putting that into our atmosphere so we can take care of it, and hold it with that grace and affirmation that you mentioned earlier.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. That's why I wanted to be here for this conversation, because I know it's important. I feel like I'm holding I'm trying to speak to experiences that I'm still trying to navigate. So I appreciate that.
That's fine.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have that level of self-doubt. Some of us are a lot further along in accepting. I mean, I'll since you're sharing, right? One of my biggest hangups is acknowledging compliments on my aesthetic or my look, right? Um, it's I know it's hard to believe, all of this, but one of the struggles I have with Jackie is she'll give me a compliment based on my aesthetic and my look, and it makes me uncomfortable. Not that I think she's wrong or that I'm not. It's been the hardest for a long time to accept that I'm handsome. Once again, a lot of it is rooted in my childhood of being seen as, Haitian booty scratcher, this ugly person. My culture and my presence were at one point aligned, and that was how I saw myself. And so, just to that point is I feel you, Takia, because a lot of times, I mean, in my 40s, well, in my as I'm 40, it's taking me this long to acknowledge and accept that, like, I'm fine. I'm fine the way I am. I should start accepting how I see myself and how other people see me, except for if it's negative, of course, right? But um, yeah, it's deep because Kiba give me these praises all the time, and I'm like, Kiba, chill. That's not me. That's not me. And it's we're all works in progress. If we're not working on ourselves, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So I appreciate you being vulnerable. And this is a safe space that we can all do this, and hopefully somebody else sees that. Look, we're not perfect on here at by far. And just to kind of give a little background for those of you that don't know, Ashley and I got on a group chat and we were trying to figure out, how did y'all find y'all therapist? How did y'all, like, do you stay with the same person even if it's not working, or how do we move forward? And we saw that the information is not out there, or wasn't out there. And so that's kind of why we decided to keep moving forward with this show, is because there are people that are just like you, Takia, like myself, like Ashley, like Kiba, that feel like they're on these islands alone. And you're not. You're not. And we're hoping to develop and build a community in which everyone feels like they can connect. They can come on here and talk about their experience. Um, they can come on here and feel as though that we are family. So it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to release. And Takia, I think you and some of our past guests have blessed us beyond measure. And I just don't think you understand that um, saying that you're comfortable enough to talk about what you talked about, that's everything that this show, this organization is about. So, I kind of quick interjection to say thank you for being here and sharing.
I appreciate that. Let me just give a other side of it that I think that had to happen. Because imagine if I didn't. Imagine if she had told me I was pretty every day. Imagine if I had walked in that. Imagine if I had all this consciousness of my color and how other people reacting to it. Who knows the type of person I would have been. So while it's difficult and I'm where I am now, I'm glad that this is where I am, because maybe that's the way my sauce needed to be made.
Mm.
And that critique, right? Being able to critically analyze your own personal experience. I think a tremendous amount of self-awareness and self-inventory and picking apart of self. And it helps you show up more authentically. It helps you kind of deep dive into your own being to show up as yourself, and then model that for someone that might be struggling with that, and maybe not even intentionally. Like, people will gravitate towards that. I think when we think about the debate, the light skin dark skin debate on a one-to-one personal level, um, there are elements and aspects of that are rooted in opinion, experience, nature, nurture, that you can hide behind. But when we look in the larger context of the world, like when we look at Hispaniola, right, and how historically people on one side of the island have been treated a certain way, and people on the other side of the island have been treated a certain way. When we look at just the so-called shithole countries and acceptance of immigrants from different places and how that rolls out and plays out, we see that there is a persistent narrative in the larger world of certain things, and they might either affirm what people's initial sense of connection to those issues are, or they might refute them. And I think it's important to not move in a way that is driven by that, but that you have a sense of acknowledgement of this is kind of like what's going on, and this is how I'm going to show up in that exchange, in that conflict, because I don't want it to exist inside of me as much as how I observe the world, because it can be overly influential if it exists in you in a way that causes you to really break down. But it's hard because depending on your positionality, it might be something that shows up in your everyday, all day, every day, or not. So it just depends, As Ashley mentioned before, being out in the summer and playing for hours and hours and hours and coming back, and someone that you love, someone that loves you mentioning, oh, I don't want you out in the sun because you're going to get too dark. So then you start to think, what's wrong with being too dark? well, dang, grandma said I don't want me to be too dark. So what is it? And it becomes I was talking to my daughter about it. I was like, my daughter runs track. And I was like, and she has locks. And I'm like, one of the reasons why I made sure that I put locks in your hair is because I don't want you to say, I don't want to run or I don't want to swim or I don't want to play ball because of how my hair shows up. And how people will perceive me in my hair and having to fix it up. And having gone through that myself, I just wanted her to have choices. Now, if she gets older and wants to choose something different, I'm all for it because I'm all for her own personal expression. But just telling her a little bit about my decision making so that she kind of comes into my understanding um, is a part of how I make meaning of me still learning and growing into who I am as well.
I respect the part around the dialogue and the dialogical praxis that you're engaging in. That type of transformative learning is key, like learning alongside. It
Mm-hmm.
takes a lot of humility, I
Mm-hmm.
think, to do that type of work. So I just wanted to give you I just want to honor that.
Yeah, because they know.
Yeah, word.
I was a classroom teacher for many, many years, and they'll be like, nah, we good.
Yeah.
They'll tap out. They know instinctually, they understand. And there's a trust contract that has to happen. So if they can't trust you with yourself, they're definitely not going to trust you with their love or respect or how
Yeah.
they're thinking about the world, even critically,
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe that's the beginning of how we shifted that awareness and that like consciously saying, hey, this is my thought process. This is what I'm thinking through and really standing in that. Because maybe it is imperfect, but there'll be that respect for you actually saying it. And it gives them a chance to ask, is this how I want to hold it? Is this not how I want to hold it? Maybe that's the beginning of starting to loosen some of the reins here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the best thing you can do in front of a young person is make a mistake and acknowledge it,
Yeah.
or to move through a space of questioning yourself, and they embrace this idea of no, mastery isn't present all the time, and there's a learning, and you're at a novice stage, and then you're intermediate, and then like you move through phases of learning. And I think as adults, as educators, sometimes we try to show up too masterful, and that vulnerability is where the entry and access point is. So
Yeah, and I agree.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think it's crazy just the little things that we pick up because when you were talking about how I was talking about playing outside all day, I had a cousin. I have a cousin who's really light skin, green eyes, light hair, and we were talking randomly, and he's never drank coffee. And on one side of my mind, I'm like, how can you never drink coffee? But on another side, I remember hearing the people say, if you drink coffee, you'll get dark. And I'm pretty sure somebody kept him from drinking coffee his whole life. I'm
That's
not
a
saying
southern.
it's
That must be a
true.
southern thing.
Nah, that person's never been to Miami because
Oh, you drink that Colombian coffee.
yeah,
We all.
at 2 o'clock.
They really say that in Mississippi. Like you
Oh
can't drink if you
wow.
drink coffee, you're gonna get dark.
Wow, that's crazy. That's
Um,
crazy.
but I also want to touch on something because I think Tequila, you touched on it, but both of you or either you, when did you kind of embrace your skin tone, or was there like a time when you kind of got past what greats and grannies and aunts and uncles were saying to accept your skin tone?
I love that question.
Yeah. In other words, when did you get comfortable with the skin you're in?
Um, I'm gonna be honest. It took me some time, um, because I was in a world that I think was different than everyone else, to be frank. Like my mother was a very public figure, and showed up on TV screens and in movies and all of these things. So, um, visibly, how I showed up in a space, and I talked about the dynamic between my older brother and I, and how he was lighter skinned, and I saw there to be preferential treatment for him sometime. And so, for me, I had to unlearn and relearn certain things. And then there were pivotal people along the way that showed up. And that's why we don't know the power of our influence and how we show up. And so I had a babysitter, she was fly. And she was partially deaf. And I used to be like, man, I hate that I have a gap in my tooth. And da 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 da. She's like, that's the most beautiful thing about you. Changed my whole life at like 8 years old. Like I couldn't perceive of getting braces to change how my teeth not. So you never know who's watching or how they're watching. And so for me, there was a few people um, that just stand out. Actually, Jackie's actually one of them. One of the people that stood out in 14, 15 years old and coming into yourself. And, we were young Black girls in an urban environment that were smart, that were athletic, that were doing all these different things. And she's always been that kind of person. Like she's always been that. And so whereas I would be cracking jokes and laughing, and she would crack jokes and laugh, but like when there's a mirror of wow, I love how this person is really embracing the skin that they're in. And it happened to me in the 7th grade. It happened to me in the 5th grade. It's just how people were allowed to show up, that took away some of the texture of the messaging that the world was telling me or that I was getting and receiving from the world, despite being um, from a very Black conscious family, growing up in a Pan-African home, growing up in a home where Blackness was held on a particular platform, and even in a subversive way from a Rastafarian perspective with locks and hair and like really Bundong Babylon type of mentality, those things still existed. And so it's important that we know that whenever you show up as your authentic self, somebody's watching. Somebody's looking, somebody is embracing, and then now I get to do that for my daughters. And so when they're rocking their locks around and confident, I feel amazing because I know that the way in which that I choose to walk in the world, in any building or any setting or scene that I'm in has impacted them, and that's like enough. Even though the tentacles go deeper than that and go further than that, it feels really good to know that I get to live in that. And so I guess just seeing those mirror images growing up and seeing people um, step into who they are unapologetically allowed me to embrace. And so when I was 17, I was in a music group. I was in my first music group. And that's kind of when I was like, yo, this is it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm here. What's up? And I think it's important. Oh, you're welcome, Jack. That's the truth. Um, that's when I knew that this was here. I'm here, and I'm a force to be reckoned with, and I'm a mother of the earth. So, what's up? You understand? That's deep. That's a long answer, but today we getting deep today.
I am looking forward, Kiva, to getting to know you more. I was going to say it out loud.
It's going down. It's a wrap. I'm deal for you.
My mom had a gap growing up, and the gap closed in eventually. But anytime she would see somebody with a gap, she'll be like, "I love your gap," and I can see that other people are still wrestling with the gap, and I have to come up afterwards and be like, "Listen, my mom's complimenting you. She's not trying to be funny. She doesn't have the gap anymore, but she had it." So that's interesting. I guess it's a little different for me. I grew up. I had all Black dolls. We could only watch TV on the nights that Black TV shows came on. So you remember it used to be like 1 or 2 nights a week when all the Black shows would come on. Anytime anyone tried to give me anything that had sort of white characters in it, my parents would actively give it back. So if anything, I grew up with all my dolls and whatnot actually being darker skinned than I was. Moving to more of my adulthood, I've almost like gone out of my way to get a tan, and this is kind of cosmetic, but I have a hairy face, and so when you're light skinned, people can see that hair a lot more easily. So I kind of would always try to tan so that it would kind of cover up some other things that I was trying to work through and deal with. But my grandmother was really an instrumental person in my life, and she was really light skinned. She had red hair naturally. She looked a certain way. And so as I'm getting older, I'm learning to embrace certain parts of myself because I'm starting to look more and more like her. So if I take the colorism part out, if I take the whether or not I'm light skinned or dark skinned, I'm watching my hair turn red at the tips now. And all I can think about is I'm looking like my grandma, who I still miss. And I think it's been like 14 or 15 years at this point. So I'm coming to embrace myself in that sort of, I call it inherited drip. I'm sort of really starting to lean into my inheritance, because there's also a spiritual component of that to me as well, and just how she carried herself and operated in the world. So it feels like a blessing to start to look like her as I'm getting older, from my freckles to everything. But growing up, the concept of being Black was something I always readily embraced. But the real specifics about my skin tone, I'm seeing a lot deeper now than I used to.
Mm. So I want to ask this question. The next iteration of these conversations, like, how do we create a safe space to allow the debate to occur such that it's not necessarily one is better than the other, right? Because we see that based on the question earlier, it's all in the receiver. It's all, what they say, your perception is your reality, right? It's that person's perception of self that determines whether or not they fit the stereotypes of a light-skinned person or a dark-skinned person. How do we create this a safe space so that we're kind of beyond the conversation of who's better, but how do we come together and work together? Because the follow-up would be, you know how early do we have these conversations? And I think Kiva talked about it earlier, is that she was very conscious in how she raised her children to see color. Well, not necessarily to see color, how to see themselves, right?
Yeah.
And not seeing that, oh, somebody is darker or lighter, but somebody is genuine, somebody is kind, somebody is thoughtful. It's more on how the person makes them feel as opposed to what they look like. So the first question is, how do we create a safe for these conversations to have? And how soon can we have it? And this is kind of in part to, I think everybody in this group now has been part of TRP at one point or another, right? And there's a melanin conversation, there's a beauty conversation, there's a self-expression conversation, there's a missing history conversation that in which TRP gets itself involved in, or not involved, teaches the youth as well as mentors, because I know I've learned a lot. um how do we create these spaces, and how soon?
Wow. That's a dynamic question.
Mhm.
Um, I think that we have to approach it with the most compassion and care, because how people orient to this particular topic is rooted in a lot of trauma, in a lot of power, and a lot of privilege, and it's a very personal thing. So we have to continue to have the dialogue, but we can't have this right or wrong, a binary kind of space where it's either this or either that, because along the spectrum of color, or proximity to whiteness or hues or melanin, also is sincerely impacted by the way in which you brought or came into color within your familial context, within your communal context. If you were one Black person at white schools, your outlook is going to be very different than if you went to historically Black schools and different spaces. And then there's the pressure of home. And so we just have to handle these conversations with a tremendous amount of care, a tremendous amount of compassion, because folks come into these spaces rooted in their own experience, and the rightness of that, right? Like, I'm right because I experienced this. But then sometimes when another alternate perspective or opinion is shared, it's the source of conflict. And I think that we can start at a place where we acknowledge that colorism comes up in our community in a myriad of ways and differently for different people depending on their own lived experience. And we can grow from that space. If we don't acknowledge his presence, I think that, I think that wouldn't be the way for us to go. I think that would be an unfortunate mismanagement of community, to acknowledge it, to ensure that people have a space to speak to their experience in it, to bring factual information, research, to do a doll test or to show a doll test, to show certain things that are rooted in historical research, like Brown versus Brown Board of Education. Like it's important. It's important to have that context as well, and handle it with care.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think we spoke to this earlier, just around dialogue and making it to where folks can fully contribute. when I hear safe space, I add extra words. So safe space to fail, because it's not going to be a conversation that I think anyone is going to be able to walk into and feel like they handled it, that they handled it correctly in whatever way. But there's this sense of readiness, I think, to be able to sit in that type of conversation. So are you even aware of your feelings? Often in my practice, when I'm coaching and I'll ask people how they feel, they actually tell me what they think.
What they think.
And so I've been walking around with these emotion wheels and like having people in real time, like pull up your emotion wheel, tell me how you feel. So that emotional awareness and emotional intelligence is going to be key. I also think an aspect of it has to be intergenerational, because knowing, I talked about my great grandfather. I didn't talk about the fact that not only did he not pass, but he became so introverted because he didn't feel comfortable anywhere. So there's this like hiding and staying in the cut. And I think knowing some of that is important in terms of intergenerational trauma and understanding maybe why you show up in certain ways. But it's also important for knowing and recognizing what the narrative or the story was that maybe was told to you. So I don't know if it's a before we get into the room, go ask your grandparents and your mom and so on and so forth some questions, or if we can even have this conversation with multiple different age groups in the room. I'm not sure that that's possible, but I do think an aspect of it is going to need to be intergenerational, and I think it'll have to be mixed in with some meditation, with some yoga, with some however we think about it. But it's got to have some real intentional healing things within the body, because we're talking about color and the color of your skin, but we're not really talking about how we store this trauma in our bodies. So I would just add that.
I
Yeah.
think that's one of the dynamic things, because when I thought about when I wrote this topic down to be on the list of things that we were going to discuss this season, um, one of the things that I know I didn't want was an argument over who had it worst or who had it better or who's right and who's wrong. And I'm very grateful that we were able to have both of y'all on the show to give like super dynamic responses and deep thoughts, because y'all got me want to go read books and stuff right now. Do some research and think some more about what I thought I knew. I love this discussion. I love the fact that we were able to have a civil conversation about colorism and things that we have experienced, things that we haven't experienced, or things that have gone different ways. I do want to go ahead and check with you guys. Do you have anything going on that you want to invite the people to? Tell us where we can find you. I know Nakiba Roots and Yeah Yeah NYC, but what y'all got going on? When your next performance?
Um, okay, so first of all, I want to say I definitely check out My Grandmother's Hands. Talking about racialized trauma in the body, as Takia so gracefully mentioned, which is important. In recognizing that, and I love the healing components added to this conversation, because it is very traumatic, but we can come out on the other side healed and in the process of healing. And I think it's important that we recognize ourselves as with the capacity to heal ourselves. And I love the intergenerational. I actually like was picturing people interviewing their grandparents and interviewing older folks in there, and taking that knowledge and storytelling into a space and combining that with their own perspective, and the wealth of knowledge that we're around every day that we don't intentionally tap into is powerful. So I want to definitely lift up those aspects of that ancestors, and I think those things combined can be a great place to start. All right, boom. So as far as the other stuff goes, um, uh, I'm in a group, Black Roots. We have an album coming out this month. I'm very excited. We have album release party, so people would please stay tuned for information on that. We've been working really hard on our album, and I'm excited about the world hearing it and touring it and being in different spaces around this body of work that I've created with my partner in crime, my Black. As far as Nakiba Roots goes, I have some solo albums coming out next year that I'm very excited about and looking forward to sharing with our community, and just really being able to build on this thing that I've been working within for like 15 years. Um, as far as my organization, Yeah Your X goes, we're in and around not only the city, the country, but now different countries and different spaces. And so, stay connected and see um, our offerings and how, you know, you can become a part of that conversation. And then currently right now the Royalty Project cycle is in the mix. So if you haven't been able to see Jackie right on time, the Royalty Project Intersessions hosts an intergenerational conversation about self-image and self-esteem. Very important that our youth have access to not only spaces where they can talk about this, but tools to navigate their own feelings as they might be grappling with things. Yeah.
Well, I will balance it out by saying I don't got nothing going on. I'm presently just trying to move to another state. So I'm welcoming and receiving all prayers, but real specifically, this is a season of reflection and harvest for me. So I guess I'll offer that and invite that to anybody that's listening, that this is a good time to reflect on where you're going and where you're headed next. But if you're interested in watching me kind of walk through that journey, my Instagram is talkverbs. My website is riseoverrun.org, so you can see a little bit of my work. But honestly, right now I have nothing going on other than trying to begin the transition to the next season of my life.
That's a lot.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And
It's
I'm
exhausting.
gonna speak it into reality. I see a Yay X and Takia collaboration,
Going down.
and we're gonna throw cheese on
I
my
love it.
cracker here. Because ultimately what we're trying to, so the last time Takia was on, it was the holistic conversation, and she was dropping so many jewels that we were like, yo, Takia, we need a cheese on my cracker like ebook, just brief touch on the things that you talked on. And I think both of you collect, like, even this subject, you guys were able to take it from so many different angles and provide so many resources that we would love to work with you both to provide our community with resources that, even if it's read this book or follow this or, you know, check this out, because you guys have a wealth of knowledge that I think adds to this conversation, but then adds to us understanding more about ourselves. So with that being said, go, you
Paige,
was gonna
before
say,
you close,
go,
can
go
I
ahead.
add a book just
Sure,
for the
go
love?
ahead.
First of all, and Kiva, I just appreciate your love. I very much appreciate it. I really, really genuinely do. Franz Fanon is one of my favorite thinkers about all things. And so the book, Black Skin, White Masks,
Like
is
that.
honestly one of my favorite books. And I think it talks a lot about the mindset and how we tend to take on the role of an oppressor when we get free. And so as we have these colorism conversations, I think that's a real go-to to think through and to compliment My Grandmother's Hands, which is a book that was recommended to me to work through with my father, actually.
Yeah.
Dope, dope.
So, Cheese on My Cracker Book Club is what I'm
I'm with it.
hearing.
I think
I'm
so.
with
I
it.
think so. We gonna make it work. So in addition to the Cheese on My Cracker book club that's coming up next month is men's health awareness, as well as Cheese on My Cracker is pushing a campaign of 30 days of fitness, 30 hours. We're asking everybody to come on and participate. The goal is to be physically fit so you are mentally fit. We're also adding to that mental clarity. One of the things that we're trying to do is raise funds for every participant. If you guys are able, donate $5. Our goal is to at least provide 3 folks with teleservices for mental health services. And if we can do at least 3 folks, that'd be great. But if we could do more, I mean, our goal is 100 participants at $5 a piece if we can. If we blow that out the waters and we're able to do so much more for our community, we would greatly appreciate it. Campaign information is coming out soon. We're asking 30 hours in 30 days or whatever you can provide. Once again, your physical fitness is our most important, most priority. So, because if you are physically fit, you're going to be mentally fit. With that being said, we have a few episodes coming up. The Wellness Collective has the Strong Black Superwoman coming up October 27th. We have Seasonal Depression on this show coming up on November 7th. We have Mindful Black Woman coming up on the Wellness Collective on the 17th. Are there any good black men out there? Clearly there are, on the State of the Black Man's Mental Health on November 19th. And then Corporate Revolution, Black Corporate Revolution, on this show on November 24th, and the Black American Identity on December 5th. Once again on this show. So those are just a few shows that we have coming up. And we know we've kept you guys this long. We appreciate it. We love you all. Takia and Kiba, please stay on. And with that said, stay safe, everybody. Peace.
Much love.